All right, welcome back. Today, we're unpacking a really fascinating and, frankly, deeply unsettling piece of history. We're going to explore how a massive, highly secretive woodland fortress known as the Lair mirrored the terrifying rise and the ultimately catastrophic fall of the Third Reich. We'll be leaning on detailed historical sources and archaeological evidence to guide us through this literal and psychological descent.
So, think about this for a second. How did a heavily fortified woodland bunker become the tomb of the Nazi war machine? You know, it's really easy to think of military headquarters purely as strategic hubs, right? But what we see at the Lair is something entirely different. As we'll see, this physical structure, with its ever-thickening walls, perfectly reflects the deteriorating mental state of Adolf Hitler and the total collapse of his army.
Part 1. Building the Wolf's Lair.
To really understand this place, we have to grasp the sheer hubris of its initial construction, way deep within the freezing forests of East Prussia. Back in December 1940, thousands of workers began building this thing in brutal -5 to -30-degree conditions, and they finished the initial phase in a matter of months. Why the rush? Well, it was all to prepare for Operation Barbarossa, the massive invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler arrives here on June 24, 1941, fresh off early victories, literally believing he was untouchable. He planned to just stay briefly, but actually, he ended up spending over 800 days there.
To put the sheer scale of this project into perspective, get a load of this number, 36 million. That was the initial cost in Reichsmarks, which is roughly the equivalent of hundreds of millions of dollars today. This exorbitant expense was poured into establishing a forward command center that basically functioned as a massive, heavily guarded mini-city. And as the sources point out, it was constructed largely by foreign forced laborers who were strictly confined to the perimeter.
Now, what's wild is the intense layers of deception required here. It completely reveals the severe paranoia and obsessive need for secrecy that defined the Nazi command. It was like a giant puzzle. The paths weren't even straight, just to ensure lines of sight were totally obscured. It was literally a concealment within a concealment. The entire complex was covered with massive camouflage nets to block it from the sky. And functionally, it actually worked. The Allies never successfully discovered or attacked the Wolf's Lair from the air during the entire war.
Part 2. Hubris at Stalingrad.
As the war dragged on and that initial momentum stalled, the disconnect between the bunker's isolated reality and the bloody front lines became absolutely fatal. I mean, you might picture a military command center buzzing with early morning efficiency, right? But instead, we see this incredibly bizarre daily routine. Hitler woke up at 11 a.m. His morning strategy meeting didn't even start until 1 p.m. Lunch, regularly delayed until 5 p.m. And then he would subject his inner circle to rambling monologues about World War I and his early political days until 3 or 4 in the morning. This rigid, strange schedule shows how the Wolf's Lair became less of a functional headquarters and more of an isolated echo chamber for a leader who just couldn't bear to be left alone.
So the crucial takeaway here is that as the military situation worsened, any dissenting, experienced generals were banished. They were replaced by ultimate yes men. Other generals actually coined this dark nickname, Laikatul. It's a combination of the German word for lackey with the name of General Wilhelm Keitel. Men like Keitel and Alfred Jodl simply took disastrous orders and implemented them without question. They just reinforced the delusion that everything was going according to plan. And honestly, nothing captures the absolute absurdity taking root in the German high command quite like this. Going into the brutal Russian winter, the troops lacked completely basic supplies. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels actually went on the radio in December 1941, literally pleading with the German public to send thermal underwear to the Eastern Front. It reveals a profound, staggering lack of preparation by a leadership completely detached from the reality on the ground. The contrast here is just staggering and tragic. Think about it. In the Wolf's Lair, leaders like Hermann Goering surrounded themselves with stolen art and finery inside massive, protected, artificially heated bunkers. Meanwhile, out on the Stalingrad front lines, over 250,000 soldiers were totally encircled by the Soviets. They were enduring -40-degree temperatures, fighting in sewers, eating rats to survive, and were repeatedly denied permission to retreat by Hitler himself. And Hermann Goering's sheer hubris was mathematically devastating. When the army was trapped at Stalingrad, they needed 500 tons of supplies daily just to survive. Goering, as head of the Luftwaffe, promised he could airlift 350 tons, which, by the way, was already not enough. In reality, he ultimately failed to deliver even a fraction of that promise, effectively sealing the doom of the entire Sixth Army.
It is absolutely crucial to note from the sources that the Wolf's Lair was also a central node for the darkest atrocities of the war.
SS head Heinrich Himmler visited the bunker on average 1.6 times per month. The historical record indicates he would tour concentration camps and gas chambers, and then within a day or two, arrive at the bunker for top-secret Four Eyes, meaning completely private meetings with Hitler. It was in absolute secrecy, safely behind these layers of security, that the horrors of the final solution were organized and discussed.
Part 3. Paranoia and the Plot.
By 1943 and 1944, the war had completely turned against Germany, and while the bunker remained fiercely detached from reality, everyday German citizens knew the collapse was imminent. A morbidly funny joke actually began circulating among the public. We were winning outside Moscow, and now we're winning on the edge of Berlin. It goes to show that despite the constant propaganda of a final victory being broadcast from the Wolf's Lair, the catastrophic losses were just impossible to hide.
This growing realization of defeat led to an internal resistance. The sources detailed the famous July 20th plot led by Klaus von Stauffenberg, almost like a ticking clock thriller. Stauffenberg, who had lost fingers in combat, only managed to arm one of his 2 bombs because the meeting got pushed up and he was rushing. Plus, because it was an excruciatingly hot summer day, the meeting was moved out of the reinforced concrete bunkers and into a wooden hut with open windows. So Stauffenberg places the briefcase right next to Hitler, excuses himself to make a phone call, and leaves. Moments later, an officer unwittingly moves the briefcase behind a heavy wooden table leg. At 12:42 p.m., the bomb detonates.
The aftermath was a massive turning point. Because the blast wasn't contained within a concrete bunker, and because the briefcase was moved, Hitler actually survived. 4 others were killed, but the source notes Hitler was remarkably excited, viewing his survival as literal divine intervention. In an incredible historical coincidence, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini was visiting that exact same day. Hitler actually took him on a tour of the smoldering wreckage, posing for photographs. Ultimately, his survival triggered a brutal witch hunt, thousands of executions, and a total paranoid purge that stripped the German army of whatever independence it had left.
Part 4. The Final Collapse.
The physical ruins of the Wolf's Lair that we see today directly mirror the chaotic final days of the Reich. Even as defeat loomed, the delusions at the command center just kept going. Just look at the failure at Kursk. At the Wolf's Lair, Hitler was being presented with blueprints for new wonder weapons, the massive Tiger and Panther tanks. But German strategy relied on these overly complex machines when they simply didn't even have the fuel to run them. The Soviet reality was starkly different. They outnumbered the German forces 10-1 with their highly reliable T-34 tanks. The entire offensive was strategically and mathematically doomed before it even began. And as the metaphorical walls closed in, Hitler's physical and mental health completely shattered. Sources note he aged rapidly. His skin turned gray, he developed a severe stoop, and he suffered from constant Parkinson's-like tremors in his left hand and leg. He was kept functioning only by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, whom insiders mockingly called the Imperial Injection Minister. Morell essentially treated Hitler like a pincushion, injecting him with bizarre concoctions, including an extract derived from steer testicles, literally just to keep him standing.
The ultimate irony of the entire complex really lies in these final bunker upgrades. In 1944, as the Soviets advanced, they poured 17,000 cubic feet of concrete, creating imposing 36-foot-tall structures with internal sand layers designed to dissipate direct bomb hits. But here's the thing. They didn't build these to project power. They built them as claustrophobic isolation chambers. Hitler sat inside this unheated, massive concrete shell, reading guidebooks to London, just hiding from the inevitable. The end of the site came really rapidly. In August 1944, Soviet forces finally crossed into German territory. By November 20th, Hitler abandoned the Wolf's Lair forever, returning to Berlin. And in January 1945, the supposedly impenetrable fortress finally met its end. But it wasn't destroyed by Allied bombers or Soviet artillery. No. As the Red Army closed in, the retreating Germans packed their own bunkers with explosives and blew the complex apart from the inside out, leaving the shattered ruins we see today.
So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this final, provocative question to ponder. Knowing the millions spent, the incredible engineering, and the sheer volume of concrete poured into the freezing earth, did the Wolf's Lair ever actually protect a functioning war machine? Or was it, from the very beginning, merely a monument to hubris, a physical tomb constructed to house the delusions that ultimately destroyed them? Thank you so much for joining us, and keep questioning the history around you.